Good evening. My name is Harris Linowitz. I'm professor of Hebrew here at the University of Utah, and one of those people privileged to work on the program for this evening and for the week's programs. I'd like to mention only one of the other events of the week. I hope that you have all had an opportunity to pick up the sheet that details the rest of the events of the week. And for those of you who care to, one of the yellow stars that commemorates the bravery of the Danish in associating themselves with the suffering of their fellow Jews. The second lecture that I wish to mention, or the second matter that I want to talk about, is Ruth's reading from her memoir titled in English, Still Alive, on Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. at the I.J. and Janae Wagner Jewish Community Center, which is just up Medical Drive, 2 North Medical Drive, across from the hospital by the university. This reading, as well as this evening's lecture, as well as the films, as well as all of the other events which the University of Utah is, and the state of Utah, in fact, has presented now for 20 years, recalling with and for the people of Utah the murder of the Jews in Europe in the Second World War, is to be followed by the reading that Ruth will give at the JCC from her autobiography. I want to tell you a few words about Ruth and not get into what is her subject for this evening. Her subject for this evening is Jewish ghosts in post-war Germany, in which she will attempt to talk about the peculiarities of German culture, literary culture particularly, in regard to its perception and continuing interest in Jews of Germany and of Europe since the near extinction of the Jewish communities of Europe in the Second World War. My friend Ruth was born in Vienna in 1931. She was deported to Theresienstadt, a so-called family or children's camp in Czechoslovakia at the age of 11. Thereafter, she survived moves to Auschwitz, to the death camp at Birkenau, and to a work camp where, in some sense or other, she was reborn. She is from Vienna and continues to be Viennese, but a strange rebirth happened there. She spent 2 further years in Germany under occupation until she immigrated in 1947 to the United States. She graduated from Hunter College in New York City in 1947. She received her PhD from Berkeley in German Studies. She has been professor of Germany and chairman of distinguished German Studies programs, including Princeton. She wrote this book in 1992. It has been translated into a great number of European languages, as far as I know. And then when the time came for it to be translated and published in English, she decided to rewrite it. And so what we are privileged to read is her latest reconsiderations of this enormously rich, tragic history, and one which is retold in a unique fashion. She has retired from the University of California in Irvine, where she is a professor emerita of German. And I want to say a word or two about the voice in this book before you hear her. It is a very straightforward voice. In many ways, it is the voice of a simple witness, unreconstructed. In other ways, it is the voice of a child, lacking in sentiment, but not lacking in distance from the events of her life, the life that once was the life of the Viennese Jew. It is very clear-eyed. She is always the one who is asking, but Isn't the emperor naked? She continues to write sharply and widely on literary culture and the society of Europe and America. Tonight, she will go on in that endeavor with her characteristic daring to engage the question of why German social commentators and literati continue to think, and have since the end of the war, continue to write about Jews as if Jews were important in that culture now, as they may once have been, and then weren't at all, in fact. In a way, she will talk about this as if we are in the presence of the false personae of the figures of the Holocaust, those that have been presented in Spielberg's movie, those that have been presented in the movie called Sophie's Choice, famous recapitulations of the Holocaust in Hollywood. Here, as opposed to that, we are merited to hear an authentic voice asking and daringly seeking to answer a most intriguing question. So I'd like to introduce to you on behalf of the Committee of the Days of Remembrance, Ruth Kluger.
Thank you, Harry. Very thoughtful and kind introduction.
Yeah. See, that's how it goes.
Thank you. Let's see. Lapel, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Good luck.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. Can you hear me? Still okay? A couple of weeks ago, I watched a new segment of TV's never-ending and ever so formulaic series Law and Order. It wasn't a very good one, and once its premises were established, it ran on automatic pilot. The victim was a Holocaust survivor. That was the victim, yeah, a 76-year-old woman who was to testify in the deportation proceedings of a former German concentration camp guard. The pursuit of her killer led to the neo-Nazi scene and to deniers of the Holocaust. The good guys, that is the law enforcers, were full of predictable righteous indignation, and the white supremacists were suitably brutish. What interested me was the question, why would this predictable and somewhat trite story feel quite different if something like it was produced in Germany? You know, there's always a twist to these cases, something that makes you think a bit about the nature of justice and morality. And in this episode, the jury convicts the former German, this former Nazi, because the jury is so horrified by what he did during the war. But they convict him of having murdered the Jewish woman, the victim. And this is a crime that he did not commit in the story. So we, the audience, are left with the question whether perhaps justice was served, though the law was not. So this is a tricky question. It's typical for this Law and Order series. Now, in Germany, the focus of discussion would be on the Jewish problem. It would be, can the memory of the Holocaust subvert justice and law? And if so, can this be construed as the meaning of the movie? And in that case, could one call it anti-Semitic? Those would be the questions. The discussion, that is, would be skewed in a different direction, which means that the whole film would look different in German eyes, because these are eyes that are still fixated, negatively or positively, on Jews and what happened to them and what they are doing now. A Jew is the ultimate other in Germany, the quintessential minority member, even though there are so many other minorities by now. How do Germans deal with the Holocaust, and how does their thinking and their emotions about Jews differ from that of Americans? They deal with it incessantly, even though you'll find an attitude that wants us to believe with considerable passion that it's all passé, ever so dated. You find that often, of course not always. the attitude, what do we, the grandchildren, have to do with all this? But that too is part of the scene. People saying they don't want to hear anymore about what happened in the 30s and 40s of the last century, even though everyone is agreed that these were the most fascinating, if frightful, decades of the century. The facts belie this pretended indifference. The bookstores are full of it, both fiction and non-fiction. TV is loaded with it. There are conferences and exhibits. And the pundits eagerly discuss the new European anti-Semitism. None of this would take place if people weren't willing to give their time and their money and presumably some of their thought processes to this horrendous event. So the charge, which you can sometimes hear, that the Jews, preferably foreign Jews, are engineering this interest doesn't hold water. The German public is anything but indifferent. Jews haunt them. I propose to look at some German works of the imagination since the end of World War II that deal with Jews. But first let me say that what Germans think and write about Jews isn't always admirable or admiring, and it's rarely objective whether they admire or berate us. That said, we have to distinguish between fact and fiction, between mindset and policy. Germany has been a viable democracy for nearly 60 years and has treated Jews within its borders exceptionally well. It is particularly generous towards Jewish immigrants, with the result that there is again a growing Jewish community within its borders. You can leave that on there. There used to be 500,000 Jews in pre-war Germany, more if you count those who were assimilated and didn't consider themselves Jewish. That's about 1% of a population of about 60 million. While it is true that few immigrants, that is former German Jews, returned, yet there is a growing Jewish community thanks to a generous immigration policy for Jews. Most of the post-war German Jews are from the former Soviet Union. After the war, there were virtually no Jews in Germany, except the displaced persons from the camps. Now there are again about 100,000. That is a bit more than 1/10 of 1% in a population of 80 million. Their children are integrated and contribute to the cultural and economic health of the country. The government supports and subsidizes Jewish community efforts in various ways. It is quite possible and quite comfortable for a Jew to live in Germany today, as long as you can cope with the past. But at first, after the war, denial was the rule. Remember, the term Holocaust only came into use in the 70s. And because language is so important to our way of thinking, the genocide of the Jews didn't stand out from all the other misery which Hitler Germany had inflicted on the world. And since it wasn't identified as a special problem, the Allies did not make it a special subject in the re-education of the German people. Neither did the new German society itself deal with it. There was no attempt to remember or teach the history of European and German Jews, neither of their achievements nor of their persecution, and certainly no attempt to analyze the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. If you don't meet these things head-on in a country that had profited from and caused so much harm to its Jewish community, that is a country that knows very well that there used to be Jews and now there are none, the knowledge will become a curious, fetid, thoroughly unappetizing mishmash of memory and of old resentments that were never explained and of self-justification. By way of analogy, take the case of East Germany, the former German Democratic Republic. Whatever was wrong with it, it didn't teach or preach anti-Semitism or any form of racism, because communism doesn't, though it can be argued that it practiced some. It didn't teach racism, but it also didn't take part in any attempted restitution, arguing that it wasn't the good Germans, but the bad Nazis who committed the crimes, and that they, the socialist good Germans, weren't responsible. That was active denial. And because the issue of guilt was never properly addressed, and no one ever sorted out the difference between genocide and political reprisals, for example, the difference between incarcerating opponents of the regime and the killing of Jewish children, because of this lack of distinction, the old subterranean anti-Jewish feeling simmered on, as the stew in a high-quality double boiler will remain hot for a long time after the heat has been turned off. What we have seen of unreflected prejudice coming out of East Germany after reunification was very like the mental scenery in West Germany for years after the defeat. In literature, an interesting example was the best-selling novel Naked Among Wolves by Bruno Apitz of 1958. It was also a popular film, set in the concentration camp Buchenwald. This is East German. It deals with the heroic communist prisoners who at the end of the war liberate the camp. As prisoners, they hide a Jewish child and thus make his survival possible. The active adults whom the reader admires are political prisoners. The Jews of Buchenwald are reduced to a passive little boy, their fate infantilized, as it were. The actual condition of the Jews in that camp was much harsher than that, and harsher than that of non-Jews. During the early post-war period, there was also little sense of responsibility towards the Jews who had been forcibly exiled. The country acted as if they had left voluntarily and forfeited their citizenship of their own accord. The poet Erich Fried is an example. He was a well-known and well-published Austrian poet who lived in London during the war and asked to have his Austrian citizenship restored. Austria refused. Another case is the Austrian Jewish writer Leo Perutz, who in the 1920s was a successful author of fantastic and supernatural tales, also some science fiction. Nowadays, all his books are in print again, and many thoughtful critics think that they're not merely popular fiction, but serious literature. I confess I'm a bit addicted to them. They're so much fun. After the war, he came back from Palestine with his best novel, By Night Under the Stone Bridge, a tale set in 17th century Prague, about the dreamlike love affair of the German emperor and the Jewish woman. He had that in manuscript and wanted to get it published. He had worked on it for many years and he knew it was good, but he correctly feared that the Jewish aspects of the book would be a handicap in his attempt to find a publisher. And indeed, 6 years after the end of the war, in 1951, he got this note from his publisher, I quote, "Much as I love and esteem your work, I do believe that the attitude of present-day readers in Austria and Germany will prevent it from becoming a success." It was to be long years before this book found its public. The Jewish angle is undoubtedly now an asset and a sales point. By that time, Perutz was dead. But let me interject some personal recollections of the early post-war years. I lived in Germany after the liberation in 1945 until October 1947. During that period, I became friends with a young German veteran who planned to be a novelist and did become one of Germany's best-known and at times most controversial authors. It's a career I followed closely because I stayed in touch with Martin Walser over the years. He lent me books that were important to him. Kafka, for example, very hard to get at that time. And he was to write his PhD thesis on Kafka. But that Kafka was a Jew seemed totally irrelevant to him, except to point out that he, Walser, couldn't possibly be anti-Jewish given his admiration for Kafka. My own experience in the camps from which I had just emerged was not a topic of conversation between us. Decades later, he said he didn't know that I had been in Auschwitz. He only knew about Theresienstadt, which erroneously was considered a ghetto where Jews lived a half-very decent life. But I had an Auschwitz number on my arm, which was pretty unmistakable. To be sure, neither of us talked about our war experiences. The first Jewish character in one of his books occurs in a novel of the 50s. She returns from South America and is so clueless that she's surprised to find any remnants of Nazism in Germany. She's a preposterous and unbelievable figure in her naivete. The naivete is that of denial, which, as we all know, is the first stage in dealing with a catastrophic psychological experience. But here it is projected by a German on a Jew. And Jews, if anything, were obsessively concerned with the remnants of past ideology in Germany. During this period of denial, even the words Jude or Jüdisch were not in good taste and were left unspoken. German friends who went to school in the 50s have told me that direct references to Jews and Jewishness were somehow creepy and made them feel uncomfortable. And of course, there weren't any Jews around whom one could meet, except a few in the big cities. But there were books about good Germans who saved and hid Jews, quite a few of them. In all cases, the Jews themselves are passive, like the child in the Apitz novel. There was even an enormously popular bestseller by one Hans Scholz about Berlin called On the Green Banks of the Spree is Berlin's river, published in 1955. The first part of this novel is in the form of a reliable narrator who keeps a diary while he serves as a German soldier in Poland. He witnesses Nazi brutalities and disapproves of their treatment of Jews. But the strange thing is that the Jews are more brutal than the Nazis. In one scene, a little Jewish girl who's being beaten by, quote, members of her own race, runs to the narrator, German soldier, for protection. The scene is thoroughly absurd, given the German soldiers were known for their senseless and arbitrary shooting sprees in the Polish streets. But it allows the reader of the book to pity the child while despising the Jewish adults. And if that reader of the 1950s should feel guilty about the recent German past, this double whammy of contempt and pity is precisely the sort of placebo he might crave. There are many other less offensive stories, usually quite sentimental ones, about Aryan kids losing their Jewish childhood friends and brave men helping Jews and sometimes gypsies escape. But lest we feel too superior to such feel-good fantasies, consider a similar phenomenon in the treatment of African Americans in books and films, where the good white people save the unjustly accused blacks, thus restoring our sense of the intrinsic goodness in the hearts of the perpetrators of social injustice. There are some famous American books that do that, titles of excellent quality. For example, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, where the upright white Southern lawyer puts himself and his safety at risk while his children are watching and learning. A similar, earlier case in point is Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, where an innocent black man is saved by an old spinster and a child. Both books are acclaimed movies as well. African American writers don't write such stories. Not that black writers rule out helpful whites in their fiction. They occur. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, for example, a white woman helps the heroine, who's an escaped slave, helps her deliver a baby. In Holocaust fiction, there are helpful non-Jews, most famously Schindler. You might object that the novel Schindler's List or Schindler's Ark is not by a Jew, but by an Australian non-Jew, Thomas Keneally. But the film is by Spielberg, a Jew, so it seems to me fair to include it here as a Jewish vision of the Holocaust. Or take Louis Bagley's excellent novel Wartime Lies, about Jewish survival in Nazi-occupied Poland. It has a helpful German. The main difference is that the minority people in these books by minority authors are not passive. They're subjects, not the objects of their stories. They struggle against the odds or die their own deaths. Put differently, these stories are their stories, not the stories of the perpetrators. And as a consequence, the events themselves change, not merely the point of view. Well, back to history. What brought about a change in attitudes in Germany is hard to say. Maybe just that the truth will out and the Jews in other countries, notably in America, were busy researching and writing their history. But there are milestones. One of them occurred exactly 40 years ago with the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt. The executioners and perpetrators of the most notorious Nazi camp were on trial in a German city, accused and judged by the German system of justice. That stirred up the nation as the Nuremberg trials in the late 40s had not. Those proceedings, Nuremberg, had been considered the revenge of the victors on the defeated. In 1964 in Frankfurt, Germans were judging Germans. The most memorable literary testimony was the play The Investigation, German Die Ermittlung, by Peter Weiss, himself a Jewish refugee in Sweden during the Nazi regime, and by that time the famous author of an international success about the French Revolution, Marat Sade. The investigation used the trial record, compressing the witness testimony and the arguments of the defense into a manageable text. It was shown throughout Germany and was translated and shown in the US as well as in many other countries. Germans finally began to face up to what had been done by their neighbors in their name and ultimately by themselves. But we should also keep in mind that the chief prosecutor in the case was the person who instigated the investigation in the first place, was another returned Jewish refugee, Fritz Bauer. My old friend Martin Walser, with whom I had remained in touch, wrote an essay that was to be widely quoted, entitled Our Auschwitz, in which he voiced his horror and deep dismay at the revelations in the courtroom. There's no reason to doubt his sincerity, but at the same time, there's a curious distancing in this piece, a constant reminder of, I'm different, the people I know are different, this wasn't us. What's more, there's also an emphasis on the gulf that divides the experience of the victims, which must forever remain foreign, incomprehensible to us, the nation of the perpetrators. No bridge seems to lead from the Jews to the Germans, it would seem, because their experience divides them, though this experience involves both Jews and non-Jewish Germans. I remember that I read this essay with dismay, since my own concentration camp experience had been more or less taboo between us. I accused him privately of climbing a bandwagon. He was naturally indignant. I pointed out that all these years he had known a Jewish victim who had lost most of her family in the years preceding our first meeting. He was genuinely astonished. He hadn't thought of me in this way. The awe and respect he shows the victims in his essay is that of philo-Semitism, an attitude that makes most Jews cringe and that we always suspect of lacking sincerity, though it's vastly preferable to its opposite. Your German intellectuals were stirred into a rethinking of what had been done to their Jewish fellow citizens, and this awareness increased in the following years. In 1985, on May 8th, memorializing the end of the war, German President Richard von Weizsäcker termed the defeat of Germany in World War II a liberation, not a defeat. A liberation which should be celebrated. Looking back, he pronounced about the immediate post-war years, quote Weizsäcker. There were many ways of not burdening one's conscience, of shunning responsibility, looking away, keeping mum. When the unspeakable truth of the Holocaust then became known at the end of the war, all too many of us claimed that they had not known anything about it or even suspected anything. After the Frankfurt trial, and with a new generation in control, it became not only possible to mention Jews, it was even fashionable to treat them with empathy. In Sweden, the German Jewish refugee Nelly Sachs had been writing poetry about the Holocaust in German. Thanks to being championed by the poet and critic Hans Magnus Enzensberger, she became a celebrity in Germany and received the very prestigious annual Peace Prize of the German book trade in 1965. The next year, 1966, she shared the Nobel Prize for Literature with the Israeli poet Agnon. I might say here that the recent Nobel Prize winner for literature, Imre Kertész, the Hungarian, who writes only about the Holocaust, was also first championed by German critics and got the beginning of his worldwide reputation in Germany and Austria. In 1967, Alfred Anders, who had previously written some of the sentimental stories about Jews that I've mentioned, published the novel Ephraim, which won high praise for its first-person narrative in which a returned Jew encounters his former compatriots. I think it's a problematic book, for while it purports to come to terms with the Holocaust, its consistent message is that there's no explanation for the Holocaust. Therefore, why bother digging into possible causes? The realization that Jews are people like you and me had a troubling flip side, the underbelly, which was the underbelly of philo-Semitism. If Jews are like you and me, they must have deep resentments against us Germans and will harm us where they can. They are therefore not trustworthy. That's like Shylock wanting his pound of flesh because he has been dissed by Antonio. That is an attitude that rears its ugly head in many films by Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Fassbinder, famous movie maker who grew up in Munich, did meet some Jews in his childhood and was told to treat them with special courtesy because they were Jews. He didn't like that, and in time his antipathy to Jews morphed into anti-Semitism, which, however, he always denied. His Jewish characters are sinister psychiatrists and criminal real estate magnates who feed like maggots on the corpse of a diseased society. Take the late film Lili Marleen of 1980, a wish fulfillment dream of a good German girl who profited from the Nazis but never liked them. The film tells the story of the Nazi pop star whose song Lili Marleen was such a hit in World War II that the Allied soldiers sang it as well as the German army. In the story, in the film, she's engaged to the rich Swiss Jew Robert Mendelssohn, whose family doesn't want her and succeeds in having her Swiss visa revoked, so that it's really the fault of the Jews if poor little Willie must identify with the Nazis. Once she becomes a success, the Swiss Jews use her for anti-fascist activities where she puts her life at risk. She gladly goes along, for she's still in love with Robert. But at the end of the movie, Robert has married a rich Jewess and lives in splendor in Switzerland, while his lover kills herself in the squalor and misery of post-war Germany. The message is clearly the Jews care only for themselves and for their kind and are unscrupulous in their exploitation of Christians. Fassbinder killed himself with an overdose of drugs in 1982. Since then, anti-Semitism in Europe has assumed a new phase. We know the classical kind, Christian in origin, based on a reading or misreading of the New Testament. It later morphed into a pseudoscientific biological superstition about inferior and superior races. Science has its own burden of superstition, just as religion does. And now add to this the anti-Judaism of radical Islam, something that came much later and derived from Western sources. Historically, Islam has not been intolerant of Jews. Finally, and hardest to assess at this time, is a new politically reactive sort of anti-Semitism that orients itself on current events. Critics of the Sharon government in Israel are accused of being anti-Semitic. Sometimes the charge is justified, sometimes it isn't. The infamous idea of a Jewish world conspiracy has gained currency in the Arab world, where Jews are said to have engineered everything from false rumors about a Holocaust that never really took place, thank you, to the 9/11 plot, to the invasion of Iraq. In Europe, Jewish synagogues and schools have to be guarded by police against terrorist attacks, and some Jewish cemeteries have been desecrated. But the memory of the Holocaust lingers. In Germany, historical memory is broken in the sense that if you want to be proud of your country, you have to check yourself by looking back at the 12 Nazi years. Where Americans call their fathers and grandfathers the greatest generation, their coevals in Germany are the most despised generation, and their war memories are under a cloud in the same war, and they can't be celebrated, not publicly anyhow. It's obvious that this state of mind breeds ambiguities and ambivalences. My old friend Martin Walser received the Peace Prize of the German book trade in 1995, the same prize that was awarded to Nelly Sachs in 1965. The recipient of this award has to give a full-length speech. Walser called his half-humorously a Sunday sermon. By now he had come to the conclusion that too much was being made of German war guilt to the detriment of the rest of German culture and history, and that it was time to stop clobbering the nation with its past misdeeds. This attitude, as we've seen, is fairly widespread in Germany, and it often implies that the general interest in the Holocaust is part of an international Jewish conspiracy imposed on the Germans. In fact, of course, Jews naturally explore their own history, but if others are watching and learning from them, it's because they want to do so for reasons of their own, not because they are forced to do so. In his speech, Walser talked of a moral cudgel, a Moralkeule, a weapon used to make Germans feel bad about themselves. He didn't say who was wielding the cudgel. The speech resonated. It hit a nerve. Many Germans felt relieved that a respectable public figure finally said what they had felt all along. Many Jews felt that Walser was putting them down and implicitly accusing them of bad faith. In a heated public controversy between Walser and Ignaz Bubis, the head of the Jewish community in Germany, Walser deeply insulted this man. Referring back to his own Auschwitz essay, he told Bubis, who was a survivor of the camps and had tried to bring together Christians and Jews in the new Germany, he told Bubis that he, Walser, had written about Auschwitz at a time when Bubis wasn't merely minding his own business. I thought what I had thought as long as I had known him, that Martin didn't have a clue of what it meant to be a survivor. And such controversies carry much more weight in Germany than they would in America. Bubis died shortly afterwards with a feeling that his life's work had come to nothing, and asked that he be buried in Israel, where his grave would be safe from desecration. Throughout all this, Walser insisted that there wasn't an anti-Semitic bone in his body, pointed to his many Jewish friends, of whom I was one. The same year that he became involved in this controversy, he published an autobiographical novel called Ein springender Brunnen, a gushing fountain or a gushing spring, about a boy's childhood on Lake Constance, where he's still at home. This book was criticized because its background is the Nazi period, and yet there's very little evidence of the dark side of the Hitler regime. Some critics felt that it was a whitewash. I confess I like this book. I think in language and structure, it's one of his best novels. While the critics have a point, I also think that in writing fiction, an author can include and omit what he wants, and this book is merely a reconstruction of one child's experience. That is something to keep in mind as we turn to a very different book, one that purported to be an autobiography, but was in fact fiction. Jews and Jewish characters had become popular, though in some strange ways. I mentioned the novel Ephraim because that was the first book where a German author sort of crawled into the skin of a Jew and wrote a first-person account from a Jewish point of view. In 1995, the prestigious Surkamp House published a purported memoir by one Benjamin Wilkomirski. Wilkomirski was a Swiss who claimed to have been smuggled into Switzerland from the East as a very young Jewish child who had lost his entire family in German concentration camps, Majdanek and Auschwitz to be precise. He tells how he survived and remembers horrendous scenes of suffering and evil, which he wasn't allowed to talk about in Switzerland, his new home. His foster parents strictly refused to listen to anything relating to his early years, and this caused him much anxiety and even paranoid reactions. For example, he would think that the story of William Tell shooting the apple from his son's head was the story of an SS man shooting Jewish children. He grew up sheltered in a well-to-do family, became a musician, and only in his 50s decided to write down these shards of recollection. The book has the title Bruchstücke, Fragments. Fragments is the title of the English version, with the subtitle Memories of a Wartime Childhood. The book received rave reviews and was translated into no less than 12 languages. Here is a quote from the New York Times review. Wilkomirski recalls the Holocaust with a powerful immediacy of innocence, injecting well-documented events with fresh terror and poignancy. Constructed like flashes of memory, the book unfolds in bursts of association, the way children tell stories. He writes with a poet's vision, a child's state of grace. Wilkomirski joined organizations of child Holocaust survivors and became a kind of spokesman for them. He appeared at psychiatrists' meetings and impressed everybody. The director of Berlin's Anti-Semitism Research Institute, a historian of high repute, name of Benz, went so far as to compare Wilkomirski's book favorably to Anne Frank's diaries and charged that readers are comforted by Anne Frank's account because it contains no horror. Wilkomirski, he argued, gives us the real thing and should therefore be considered the more important writer on children in the Holocaust. Wilkomirski received the Holocaust Award of the French Jewish Federation in Paris. Jewish Federation in Paris, it's a Shoah Award. He made a TV film about his life and the loneliness and isolation that were the permanent symptoms of ineradicable memories. The film was moving and well received. There had always been some doubts about Wilkomirski's veracity, but in 1998, a diligent Swiss journalist turned up evidence that the whole story was a fraud. Wilkomirski wasn't even a Jew. He was born in a village in French Switzerland to a non-Jewish woman and was put up for adoption by his mother because he was illegitimate. He then spent some time in an orphanage in Zurich, and that orphanage plays a part in this book, until he was adopted by a wealthy German-Swiss couple. His life story is complete without gaps and entirely Swiss. The story of his harrowing early years is a simple invention, whether based on intentional fraud or on paranoid illusions or a mixture. His German publisher has admitted that while the book was in production, he was warned that there was something fishy about this autobiography. They stopped the presses and sent a scout to Israel to consult historians and psychiatrists. They got positive replies and asked the author to write a postscript about the authenticity of his book. Then they went ahead with the production of the book. But of course, these psychiatrists and historians whom the publisher consulted can only have told them whether these memories were plausible, not if the facts were based on lived experience. For that, they would have had to go to the eastern cities where he came from, or said he came from. In his preface, Wilkomirski virtually warns the readers that they are not necessarily reading a fact-based book, but he didn't call it fiction either. He's on the defensive, but there are enough people ready to receive his fantasies as if they have just some just accreditation. Here is a passage from this preface. Legally accredited truth is one thing. The truth of life is another. Years of research, many journeys back to the places where I remember things happened, and countless conversations with specialists and historians have helped me clarify many previously inexplicable shreds of memory, to identify places and people, to find them again, and to make a possible, more or less logical chronology out of it. As you can see, there's a strange kind of prevarication in this. It's not the facts, it's the memories he insists on. And who are we to gainsay what is in his head? There's some interesting reactions to this fraud when it came out. There were those who thought that the revelation served the revisionists, that is those who claimed that the greedy Jews invented the Holocaust to enrich themselves and to grab Arab land from the state of Israel. And in fact, the Weltwoche, the Swiss paper which reported the story, had inquiries from Tehran. Then there were some who accused the investigating journalist of acting from sinister motives, although he was himself a Jew. The idea was that he should have left well enough alone because this fact-finding mission would serve the enemy. But of course, the answer to this argument is simply that you don't serve the truth, in this case the facts of the Holocaust, by dishing up lies about would-be survivors. You don't fight the super lie that the Jewish catastrophe didn't take place by shielding a liar who falsely claims that he was part of it. Now, as to the quality of this book, once you know it's invented, it doesn't automatically become fiction. It becomes a bunch of lies, which is a very different matter. Most readers simply felt cheated. Their emotions had been abused. I find the book tiresome, full of cliches, the writing mediocre, and the child's perspective unconvincing. But then I only read it after I knew that it wasn't based on true recollections. The distinction between legally accredited truth and the truth of life is meaningless to the reader. The reader wants to distinguish between narrated and historical identity. Because, and this brings the matter to its theoretical point, in an autobiography, author and narrator are one and the same. In reading a novel, on the other hand, you must always assume a narrator who is not identical with the author. That's why I think Wilder, in his novel A Gushing Fountain, has the right to include in his child protagonist's recollections only whatever seems to him relevant for the purposes of this particular book. If you think in the case of Wilkomirski is strange in its appropriation of the Jewish experience by a Gentile, let me tell you yet another variant on this theme. It's the story of Jakob Littner. This man, a Jewish businessman in pre-war Munich, was deported by the Nazis to Poland and barely survived in ghettos and hiding places. He came back to Munich, where he actually wanted to resettle, though he later emigrated to America. But during the first year of his return, he wrote a memoir which he called My Journey Through the Night, Mein Weg durch die Nacht. He too had difficulties finding a publisher because there was a widespread feeling that everyone already knew everything that was to be known about Nazi atrocities and nobody needed to hear anymore. Littner's manuscript was contemptuously rejected as not being literary enough. Nevertheless, he finally found a publisher, a beginner, and only on condition that an editor would go over his manuscript thoroughly before it could come out. Littner accepted the condition reluctantly. The editor was a young, unknown, but talented writer named Wolfgang Köppen. Köppen got the manuscript and met the author. Köppen felt superior to Littner, for he saw himself as a budding literary genius, and Littner as a small-minded petty bourgeois who didn't even understand the higher metaphysical implication of what had happened to him. Littner's book appeared in 1948. In that edition, Köppen, who had done the rewrite, was not mentioned. The title had been changed and made more sensational. It was now called Notes from a Hole in the Ground, Aufzeichnungen aus einem Erdloch. It got tepid reviews, the publisher went bankrupt shortly afterwards, and Littner emigrated to America, and is said to have disliked the changes and deletions, and was therefore disappointed with the finished product of his labors. So far so good, just one of those bad luck stories. But in the meantime, the editor went on to write novels of his own, and actually did become one of Germany's foremost authors, Wolfgang Köppen. The trouble was that after 4 highly acclaimed novels, he developed a lasting writer's block, or maybe he just drank too much, and stopped writing. His publisher supported and subsidized him for many years in the hope that some great works were still in the offing. And then Köppen remembered that old novel which he had once edited and which had been out of print for a long time. In the meantime, it was 1992, and things Jewish were fashionable. He and his publisher decided that Littner's story had been his book all along, that the changes he had made were so significant that he could with good conscience pretend that he had really written it. In a preface to the new edition, Köppen denied that he had met the author personally. He pretended that he had worked from scattered notes which Littner had left with his publisher, and that Littner had been looking for a writer to tell his story, whereas in reality Littner, having told his own story, had been merely looking for a publisher. As an old novel of the famous Wolfgang Köppen, the book was widely reviewed and treated with respect. Littner himself had died by then, but his relatives in America were understandably displeased. Nowhere in the new edition did it say that Köppen had worked from a completed manuscript which he even felt obliged to cut in places. Since the publisher was the prestigious Surkamp House, the case caused a bit of a scandal, and a number of writers and scholars took sides. Finally, 2 years ago, in 2002, another publisher came out with the original Littner book, which in the meantime had been published in an English translation in the US. I reviewed this book, the German, the original, and I did a careful comparison of the 2 versions, Köppen's and Littner's. And there's no doubt in my mind that virtually everything in Köppen's so-called novel is plagiarized. There's some small stylistic changes which don't improve the text, in my opinion. But even if you prefer these poetic changes, they are not significant enough to stand up under scrutiny as an independent rewrite. In the paperback edition, only Köppen's photo appears on the cover, whereas Littner, the true author, was reduced to a quasi-fictional character. My sense of this affair was that someone whose peacetime life had been destroyed had been robbed of the last thing left to him, that is the experience of the deprivation and survival and the words he chose to tell about it. And again, it was the society that had robbed him in the first place that had done it again. Never mind that the man who appropriated his manuscript was a famous novelist. Even if he had improved the text, which I don't think he did, he would still have committed yet another act of what used to be called Aryanization, that is the taking over of Jewish property by non-Jews. The most recent case that has stirred a controversy with regard to a portrayal of a Jewish character is again a novel by Martin Walser called Death of a Critic, Tod eines Kritikers, published in 2002, less than 2 years ago. Even before it appeared in print, it was attacked and caused a literary political controversy, which incidentally later helped to make it a bestseller, naturally. It was to appear in installments before publication in a major newspaper. This paper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, had previously serialized several of Walser's novels. This time it rejected the manuscript And the publisher wrote a long article attacking the book for its anti-Semitic slant. Copies for a select few were soon available by email on the internet, and everyone who had to do with literature in Germany weighed in, both before and after publication. The book is a satire, not a very good one, on a German critic who has great power to make or break a book, but has no imagination, crude tastes, and who delights in destroying careers. The problem is that he conforms to every Jewish stereotype. A heated controversy before and after publication took place in virtually every German paper and magazine, not to mention radio and TV, somewhat akin to what we have experienced with regard to Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ. I believe that Walser's book is unforgivably anti-Semitic, and I have said so in print, which means that I'm telling you about the end of a long friendship. The author cannot be simply called anti-Semitic. That's too simple. It's much more complicated and adds up to the post-war confusion about Jews in the German mind. But the text is anti-Semitic. Walser has many defenders among German intellectuals. I mean, that can happen. I don't know what goes on in people's minds. I just know what goes on in the text because I was trained to see this. You wouldn't go ahead and call Shakespeare an anti-Semite even if you feel that Shylock is an anti-Semitic presentation of a Jew. Well, Walser has many defenders among German intellectuals and claims that what I call Jewish stereotyping is unknown to him. I think this claim is by someone who was educated in the Hitler Youth is disingenuous. By the way, Elie Wiesel's work used to be published in German with an introduction by Martin Walser. Wiesel has asked to have this preface deleted from future editions. By this time, you may well ask, is there no way out? Is there no writer who treats the Jewish experience as part of German or European experience and history and manages to integrate the two? Actually, there is one, whose books have also been successful in America. The most thoughtful non-Jewish German writer about issues relating to Jews and the Holocaust was, in my opinion, W.G. Sebald, S-E-B-A-L-D, Sebald, who unfortunately died in 2001 of a heart attack while driving a car. There are two major works, a collection of stories, The Emigrants, and his last novel, Austerlitz, The Immigrants and Austerlitz. There's more, they're all good, but these I think are major. They deal with homelessness, Jewish or non-Jewish, the decline of Europe into an indifference that erodes the environment as much as human lives. They deal with coldness and memory, and they are filled with a heart-wrenching, though subdued sympathy with suffering. Sebald was not only a creative writer, he was also a teacher and scholar of German literature in an English college. Somehow Jewishness, being a Jew, was a preoccupation for him, presumably because it didn't appear to him as the exception, but rather paradigmatic for modern man. Even in his early scholarship, before he began to write his own creative works, he often dealt with Jewish writers and felt a kinship with Jewish themes. For example, in an interpretation of Kafka's Castle, he sees in this late novel of Kafka's a representation of the Jewish diaspora, calling it by the Hebrew word galut. And in its hapless hero, K, he sees the surveyor, he sees the expected Messiah. Sebald wrote about the Jewish Austrian writers Hermann Broch, Arthur Schnitzler, Elias Canetti, and about the ghetto authors at the edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Joseph Roth and Karl-Emil Franzos, and later about the Holocaust survivor Jean Amery, who has written memorably about the experience of torture. These were not efforts at some kind of restitution. What attracted him to these men and their works was their lack of illusion, their pessimism, their melancholic outlook, and their outsiderdom, all qualities with which he could identify and which he later incorporated in his stories and novels. In his collection of stories, The Emigrants, Jewish and non-Jewish characters are so intermingled that some careless readers have concluded that they are all Jewish. The novel Austerlitz, his major work, I think, has for a hero a Czech Jewish boy who is sent to England to escape the Holocaust and grows up in a devout Christian family without knowing his background. Later in life, he becomes a historian of architecture and retraces his own history together with Europe's. As you see, Jewish and non-Jewish concerns merge in these works. There's no easy conclusion to these telltale signs of Germany's unease in confronting its past. However, West Germans have made valiant attempts since the 60s to integrate those 12 infamous years into their consciousness and their view of themselves and their traditions. To see the difference, you only have to look at Austria, which has been much slower and more reluctant to do the same, and to East Germany under communist rule, as I did at the beginning. Nevertheless, for Germany too, there have been bumps in the road. Some of these, as they manifest themselves on the literary scene, I've tried to sketch for you. What remains a puzzle and a mystery to me is why the Jews, a tiny minority, still loom so large, as if the German imagination were a haunted house. And perhaps that's exactly what it is. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer questions.
So I want to mention several things. First, Professor Kluger will answer your questions here for as long as you have them, within reason. Second, her autobiography, her memoir of the Holocaust and her experiences is on sale, and she will be happy to sign it for you outside in the foyer. And third, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of this particular talk. This particular talk was stimulated by my colleagues.
Maybe you should take to.
Yeah, maybe.
But then you have to give it back to me when it's my turn again.
Okay, I promise.
This is just a loan.
Okay, loaner. He was stimulated by my colleague Ron Smeltzer and his interest in Charles Sydnor. Mr. Sydnor will be speaking in a special address on April 16th, Friday, that is, at 3 p.m., on the work that he has done with the falsifications of testimony by camp guards concerning their involvement or their lack of involvement, their presence or their lack of presence at the murder of Jews in camps where they were working. It was this that brought me to ask Ruth to begin to approach the problem of falsification of identity in Germany and in regard to the Holocaust. And I am very much indebted to my friend Ron Smeltzer for leading the way in this. I'm also indebted to my colleague Joe Metz for having recommended to me, professor of German, for having recommended to me the first approaches which I was able to take to Professor Kluger. So I want to recommend that lecture to you as a follow-up to this lecture, further entry into this very perplexing problem. With that, then, I will turn the microphone back over to Ruth to answer your questions and remind you once again of her reading from the autobiography, which is an open reading tomorrow evening at 7:30 at the Jewish Community Center, and of her book. I have to say I've given away many copies of her book. I normally don't give away copies of books. I normally lose them. But in this case, I'm proud to have helped other people to her work. You want to take questions, or you want to talk?
If you want to keep track of who, if somebody.
Yeah, I've heard from other Holocaust survivors that in the 5 to 10 years after the Holocaust, I don't know an exact amount of time, but that general discussion in Europe and in North America didn't generally, people didn't talk about the Holocaust much. There was a general feeling that, I don't know if it was a feeling, but that it just wasn't a discussion in the public forum. And I was just wondering if you found that to be the case, either, I think you were in Europe, if that was the case in your experience.
Yeah, well, you know, it was a sort of a mixture. Of course, in some sense, everybody wanted to get away from what had happened and start anew. You know, start with building up lives again. But there were degrees of avoiding the subject. And of course, understandably, the greatest denial was among the perpetrators, not among the victims. But it is quite true that everywhere there was a sense that this was not something we talked about. As I said, I think part of it is also that there wasn't even, the concept Holocaust didn't exist. It came in only in the 70s, late 70s, I think. This business of repression and denial it's very complicated, because you can always argue against it. That of course there were the Nuremberg trials. People knew that 6 million Jews had been killed. But you know, in Germany they like to say 6 million people have been killed. And if you said Jews, they would indicate, well, we are tolerant and Jews are people to us. You know, you know, it was that sort of thing. Yeah. You want to, yes, in the, yeah.
I'd like to ask a question, please, Ms. Kluger. Why are the Jewish people so nice to the German people? I mean, I heard you talking pretty nice about some of the German authors, and even Jewish people are going back into Germany. I mean, aren't you guys like really afraid? I mean, because there's a lot of German propaganda here in America. I mean, they did such a filthy thing. I mean,
well, you know, your question, the way you put your question already implies that you have a ready-made answer. That is, Jews shouldn't be. Jews should have a different attitude towards Germans from what they have. This is what you're saying, right?
I have a feeling that you guys are trying to make friends with the German people again, or something. I don't know.
But I mean, this is what you. I mean, that's what's implied in what you're saying, that one shouldn't be friends with Germans. Well, why not? You know, I mean, Germans aren't Nazis anymore. For 60 years, as I said, they've had a democracy that has supported anti-Semitism considerably less than, say, Argentina.
So you want me to
But where you can buy the protocols of the Elders of Zion in bookstores, and which has accepted a lot of Nazi criminals, which the Germans would have prosecuted. And you really have to distinguish between what happens at a given time and what happens later.
So the Germans are not.
No, of course there are. You know, there aren't any Nazis anymore. There's nowhere. There's such a thing as neo-Nazis, and they are the neo-Nazis are again. It's a different mentality. You can say it's just as unpleasant, but it's a different mentality, and I'm not sure that there are more of those, even percentage-wise in Germany than there are in other countries. In any case, I don't live there anyhow. But as far as the literature is concerned, the authors are concerned, why should I let Hitler take this away from me? That was mine. I know the language better than he ever did. You know, I can speak it. I can speak in a much more literate way than he ever did, and the Nazis actually never did know it. I certainly know the literature. This is my heritage. You know, they took everything they could take, but this is something they couldn't take. So why should I give it up?
I think that's great. You're doing what you want to do. Thank you very much.
Does that? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd be very curious about your take on several emerging narratives in Germany in the last few years and the implications for German attitudes. And that is the reappearance of a narrative of Germans as victims of World War II.
Yeah.
And ironically, your man you mentioned, Zabel, triggered one narrative by criticizing post-war German authors for not dealing with the German bombing.
That's right, yes, that's right. And Günter Grass is another one.
Günter Grass is another one that triggered the narrative as German expellees as victims.
But I think both Grass and Sebald cannot really be faulted as coming at this from the point of view of whitewashing Germans. They're just adding to the record. And of course, some of the suffering of Germans was enormous. I mean, we have to keep in mind that World War II killed, by some counts, we don't know exactly, but about 50 million people. and 6 million of those were murdered Jews. This is also one reason, you know, to come back to your question, why after the war they weren't sorted out. It's a bad reason, but because the Holocaust was a special atrocity. There's no question about it. But there had been an enormous loss of human life during this war, and this is why it could become submerged in the other 50 million. And for a long time, it was only the right-wingers who would say, we Germans have been victims. And now there are some people from the middle, Sebald was never particularly to the left, I think, who say we've got to look at everything.
That was my question. I didn't impugn Sebald or Goss's
Oh, you didn't?
motives here at all.
No.
But what is the impact of the fact that now the Germans as victims narrative is mainstream? What impact will that have on German attitudes toward the Holocaust?
I don't, you know, the way these books, it had two reactions. There was a knee-jerk reaction from the left. Such books shouldn't be written. And there was a knee-jerk reaction from the right, which said, finally somebody's writing such books. I don't think that either side is going to be particularly strengthened. I think what I hope is that it's simply a question of working up the facts of history. And I can't see anything wrong with it. There was a film in the 80s by a feminist filmmaker about the mass rapes of German women by Russian soldiers. And this is definitely a subject that deserves to be treated. And it was completely vilified by the left press. It just couldn't be shown for a long. After a while it couldn't be. After a short while it couldn't be shown. They figured it was politically utterly incorrect. Well, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, if you really want to get the truth of something, you should look at all sides. I think that both Gross and Sebald do a good job. As I said, I mean, it's not as if I'm all that nice to books that I think are anti-Semitic. The Death of a Critic, in my opinion, is. It becomes anti-Semitic as soon as you criticize somebody and say and give him characteristics that qualify him as a Jew. Bubis, the one with whom Roger was sparring, once said, "You can call me a dirty businessman, but you can't call me a dirty Jewish businessman." That won't do. There was you were going to ask a question?
Did you say the concept of Holocaust emerged in
I didn't hear that.
the concept of Holocaust.
You say what is the concept of the Holocaust?
When did it emerge?
When did it emerge? Elie Wiesel said he coined the word. He used the word in this way, and I think it was. In the late 70s. Now I'm looking at you because
That's 30 years after.
Yes. But do you remember when it? I know that I had a student in Kansas who wrote a dissertation on Holocaust literature. What year was that? 80.
No, it would have to have been 72,
In late 70s, yeah.
early 70s.
Early 70s, yeah. So that was, and at that point when she wrote that, one of the people on the commission said he had never heard the word and he didn't really see how we could use that and what does that mean anyhow. So it was just beginning. So early 70s. Okay, thank you. So that's about it. That's about it.
Before that time,
Before that, one just didn't.
Determined reference.
Yeah, one just didn't really talk about it. And it was amazing how it was ignored. You know, there were. In fact, I mentioned this in the English book. There was this widely acclaimed movie, I think 1948, acclaimed because it dealt with anti-Semitism, a socially conscious film, A Gentleman's Agreement, after a novel by, what's her name, Laura, but anyhow, that deals with a Jewish GI who comes home from the war where he's valiantly fought for his country and is looking for an apartment or a house and finds that he's up against the gentleman's agreement that excludes Jews from certain areas. There's a brief mention of the State of Israel in it. There's absolutely no mention of the Holocaust. There's this Jewish soldier who comes back from having seen the horror of what was done to Jews in Hitler Europe. And there's no question, you know, the Jewish soldiers who saw this knew what was happening to Jews. I mean, you don't need a word for that. But the worst thing that happens to him in this movie, or that happens to any Jew in this movie, is that he can't find housing in the area where he wants to live. Well, it's strange if you think that, you know, that was right after the war. Yes.
I was just wondering, in the context of the various literary texts you mentioned a few minutes ago, what you make of a phenomenon like Bernhard Schlink's The Reader and all the sorts of controversies that have surrounded it both in Germany and the U.S.
Well, I don't like the Reader. I think it's a sort of a simple-minded story and not a very good one. He wrote a number of mysteries before he wrote that one, and then he wrote the story which became very popular. For those of you who don't know it, it's the story of a boy who gets sexually initiated by an older woman, and that she's strange in many ways, and ultimately finds out she's illiterate, and she was a guard in a concentration camp. And later on she repents, and she goes to prison, and she becomes literate and reads very complex books, and is in some ways redeemed. But that's about right. Huh?
Yeah, what I was thinking was less actually the content of the book per se, and more its reception, the sort of way in which it seems to have taken off and become the most popular, German book of the past.
In America, not necessarily in Germany, but it's, it did well in Germany too. But here it really took off, as you said. I can't really tell you. I don't understand market mentality, but I mean it's an easy read. It's a short read. It's an easy read. It's easy to teach. Very easy to teach, obviously, because it's simple, and it's not long. And we always in literature classes we like books that have a certain length and not more. What I object to mainly in its content is that it associates. It associates illiteracy with atrocity. Something barbaric was done by somebody who wasn't quite up to snuff. And of course, the real puzzle about why anti-Semitism took on such horrendous forms in Germany is how could it happen in a country that was as educated as Germany? So it doesn't answer my questions. I mean, you can of course argue that fiction, he can do what he likes. It's one person, and you can generalize. But I don't get anything out of it if it doesn't interpret the phenomenon to me. Then it's just I'm just indifferent to it.
There is an additional, if I may, aspect to this. The book was an Oprah book.
Yes.
Oh right, of course, yeah, it was an Oprah book.
This contributed enormously.
Yes.
Because then you had this woman's life attested to as a saintly life by Oprah herself. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Oprah series has now come to an end. I mean, the Oprah Readers Club or whatever. and with it a good deal of income for her, I imagine. And part of the reason for that was the controversy over the way in which the selection of these books was being manipulated, and for what purposes and to what degree.
Well, Oprah liked victim books.
So does Mel Gibson.
But there are actually very few books, German books, that make it in America, that become bestsellers or even just well received.
Well, I think that's spent. Enough for this evening. Let me remind you once again that the opportunity to purchase at a reasonable price from Sam Weller's, our own bookstore, one of Ruth's books, and the sign remains open to you. Thank you very much.